This is a Hinderer XM-18. It's a small version. I've carried this now for about 2 weeks with the initial edge. Haven't sharpened it. And what I'm going to do now is basically give some initial impressions on the knife, some commentary, and some questions. And again, I've only carried this for 2 weeks. It's not like I can do a very comprehensive evaluation. Now, in terms of general utility, cutting ability, and sort of light to moderate stress work, this obviously isn't in the same class as something like an Opinel, which has thinner blade stock, full height grind, and almost no secondary edge bevel. So I mean, this is about as high as you can get in terms of raw cutting ability. It's not in the same class as, say, paramilitary from Spyderco. Thicker blade stock, but again, full height, flat grind, to a thinner and more acute edge bevel. It's not even in the same class as, say, Spyderco Delica, which is one of their more robust models. Partial height grind, relatively thick stock. The edge is around the same thickness as this in the Hinderer, but they come at a reduced edge angle, which significantly improves the cutting ability. And the initial sharpness on Spyderco is generally moderate to high. So using it for general utility on anything from, plastics, cardboard, zip ties, foods, that kind of work, it's significantly behind because of the thicker blade stock, because of the partial height grind, mainly because of the edge thickness and the edge angle. And there's specifics on this below and into the discussion threads. The other thing is that it doesn't come very sharp. Basically, it has the normal edge bevel, which is ground on usually a belt sander, and it's hit on a buffer, so you end up with an edge that's very, very smooth and has almost no slicing aggression whatsoever. Not uncommon for a lot of production and even some custom knives as to where they're sharpened. So one of the big problems I had using it for the last couple of weeks was, again, the lack of slicing aggression really reduces the cutting ability. I'll resharpen it, carrying it for another couple of weeks, and see how that works out. Couple of quick comments on ergonomics, grips, security, that type of deal. There's a few problems with the grip. Some of them are kind of obvious, some of them are not so obvious. The obvious one is this is a 3-fingered grip. It's a smaller knife, probably intended for people who can't carry the full-size XM-18 or the XM-24. So when you're using it in a heavy sort of saber or hammer grip like that, part of the handle is actually inside your hand. So when you do a lot of heavy cutting, you will get a hot spot there, as compared to something like the paramilitary, which has a full-size handle. You grip it and all of the handle sort of extends beyond your hand in both directions, so you don't get that sort of hot spotting. That's kind of obvious. A few things which maybe are not so obvious. The index finger choil is really only large enough for basically a sort of pointing or precision type grip. You can't use it as a hammer grip extension. Your finger will actually be up on the blade, even without gloves. With heavy gloves on, it's even difficult to use a precision type grip. Some parts of the handle scale, the G10, actually protrude above the actual titanium scales of the knife. In around right here, it looks like an actual design intentional feature that the G10 is up higher. However, on the back, if you look along the spine right here, it's very flush in this, then it starts going above, then it goes flush again. It's not an intentional design, it's just an oversight. Small things, but you can feel it in a heavy grip. The other thing is this jimping is not 100% even. These ones, while they are cut out, are relatively round, or at least the edges are broken. This last one right here is very sharp. Run your finger down over it, you can feel this one is very sharp compared to the rest. So when I was doing sort of heavier cutting, there's abrasion from this little jimping point there. Again, not the end of the world. You get a nice tapered diamond file, work it a bit in there, that smooths out. Very easy to smooth down the back of the G10, make it 100% flush right there. Otherwise, the texturing on the G10 is rather nice. It's kind of grippy, but it's not overly abrasive, and it has a relatively interesting pattern. And Cody has talked about that in his videos. You get a different texture going up and down than you do going basically side to side. So when the knife is in your hand and it's moving slightly, as it always does, up and down this way, you don't get a lot of abrasion. But trying to pull the knife out of your hand, you do get it. So it adds security without adding a lot of discomfort. That's kind of nice. I did find it hard to operate with larger gloves on, mainly because of the size of the knife and just because thumb studs in general are not as easy to operate as the large holes the Spyderco runs, again with large gloves on. Without the gloves on, no real issues. In terms of the steel, I find it a curious choice. It's Dortech 20CV. This is a very high carbide steel, the same as M390. There's a number of these steels, all made by different companies. They all have different names. They're the same steel. If you want a couple of points of comparison, this steel is the same as the old CPM 440V or S60V with a slightly lower vanadium load. So basically it's slightly a bit tougher, but not as wear resistant as X60V. The hardness and the corrosion resistance is about the same. Another point of comparison, it's similar in toughness to S90V, however it only has half the wear resistance. If that sounds rather remarkable, it's because this steel, Dortech 20CV, contains a lot of chromium carbides. Chromium carbides are relatively large, so they reduce toughness significantly, but they're very soft compared to vanadium carbides, so they don't give a lot of wear resistance. So if you take a steel and optimize it so most of the carbide is vanadium or other similar carbide formers like tungsten or niobium, you get a steel which has a maximum toughness to wear resistance ratio, and S90V has that design. Now if you think, well, why wouldn't you do that with every steel? Well, because in some steels you want a mix of carbides, because not all steels are used for knives. This is not a steel that was designed and intended to be used for knives. And in some steels, what you have is steels that are designed for adhesive wear resistance, and that's when you have two metals and they're grating against each other like this. When you're trying to achieve a steel that has a very high ability to resist wear like this, with two metals grating against each other, you want a distribution of carbides. You don't want all the one carbide, because carbides can actually stick together due to the bonding of the carbides when they hit. So if you had all vanadium carbides, it wouldn't be as good as having a mix. That's again for adhesive. But for knives, adhesive wear resistance is not really a factor. It's not like you're going to take this and start carving down other steel. It wouldn't be very good for the knife. So again, I find it a curious choice of steel. It's not a steel designed for knives. Adhesive wear resistance is not something that is of any value in knives. And what you end up with a steel is that it has an extremely high wear resistance, which is relatively nice to have, but the grindability is very low, which means that if you do actually damage the edge and you hit something hard, it takes longer for you to get it out. Whereas, for example, if you took this and made of a steel like, say, 19C27 or something like that, it would be tougher at a higher hardness with the same corrosion resistance, much higher grindability. Yes, it would have a reduced wear resistance, but again, if you start thinking about what this knife is used for, is it really used for low stress cutting, where you're basically looking for a lot of wear resistance, or is it used for very heavy cutting, where the edge might actually get damaged? In that case, you want a bit more hardness to prevent the edge from denting, you want a bit more toughness to prevent it from chipping, and you want a really high grindability so you can repair it. So again, for me, odd choice for a steel. Very expensive steel, doesn't really offer anything of really a lot of value to a knife like this that I can see. A couple of questions that I have on this after using it for a while. Obviously, if you compare it to something like a paramilitary, this is one that I actually reground, so the stock ones don't come with an edge as thin as this. But even a stock paramilitary will outcut the XM-18 by a factor of about 2 to 1 on woods, plastic, ropes, that type of deal. So it's obviously made for heavier use in the paramilitary, and you can really see that in the tip, and you see basically how slim the tip gets on the paramilitary and how thick the stock is retained on the XM-18. So the immediate question which comes to mind after about 2 weeks is, what kind of tasks are the XM-18 ideally suited for? Where you have something like the Spyderco Delica and you say, well, I don't want to use this because it's going to get damaged. I need to use the XM-18. That's the kind of thing that it will be interesting to see where the added durability of the higher edge angle on the XM-18 comes into play, where it will take less damage than the Spyderco Delica. The other thing which is actually going to be rather curious is, even when that happens, because I'll be carrying two of these side by side, the grindability on the VG10 Spyderco Delica is much higher than the grindability on the Dortech 20CV, which means that even if the Delica took slightly more damage, it would be much faster to repair. So again, that's a curious question that I raise about the steel. Now, one of the things people often say about the XM-18 is it has a similar build quality as the Chris Reeve Sebenza, which is basically known for setting a standard for fit and finish and consistency, but it's much more durable. Now, I would argue that the fact that, yeah, I think if you lay the two of these side by side and you ask somebody about the quality and attention of the maker, they'd say they were about similar. I do sort of take exception, though, to people looking at this knife and saying, well, it's obviously a lot more durable, because they see a couple of features and they look particularly durable or particularly strong compared to the Sebenza. And if you look at, for example, the stops or the spacers, it's obvious that the ones on the Hinderer are, of course, a much heavier duty design. The concern that I have, however, is that nobody seems to really be evaluating whether or not the functional strength is actually more significant. They just look at a couple of aspects, as I said, and say, well, these aspects are obviously much stronger, therefore the knife is much stronger. Unfortunately, for a design of an integrated system like this, the functional strength of it is whatever the weakest point is, because that's what it's going to fail. So it doesn't make any difference if parts of it are very, very strong, unless all of it are very, very strong. And that's the kind of thing that's very difficult to evaluate just by looking at it. You actually need to take the tool out and use it in a manner that actually would be damaging to some other knife and say, okay, well, it can do that, they can't, it's functionally more durable. I haven't seen a lot of people do that, and thus I question the fact everyone is claiming that it's more durable, but there's not a lot of actual tests of the durability going on. One last point, the lock seems relatively stable. I haven't seen any movement of the blade. It does, however, have a feature that a lot of integrals come with, and that it has extremely early lockup. When basically opened relatively gently, if you open it with a lot of force, you'll smash the blade over a bit more. But if you open it relatively gently, the actual liner or integral barely engages the tang of the blade, and I find that actually quite ludicrous. It's ludicrous to the point that it's laughable to me that people look at this and say that it's a functional, secure, or durable lock, or they look at it and judge the strength of the liner or the thickness or some kind of mating surface. The only thing here that functionally adds to the strength are the parts that are actually in line with each other. And what you can get on bare alignment like this is an actual shear or surface crack, because basically once you load this blade and it starts to torque down, it will produce a compression force on this liner. Because not all of it is going to be under compression, there will be a shear on this. And with liners that barely engage like this, I've often snapped the face of them off with very, very light loading, because again, it's very easy to induce an extremely high pressure here because your contact area is so small. Now, if you look at this, you can break it in, and all you essentially do is you take the knife and you snap it open as hard as you can. And of course, each time you snap it open, you draw this in, you artificially wear it. I find that, again, a bit silly that a knife manufacturer or maker would actually release a knife that's not functionally as strong or as durable as it should be unless you do something to actually make it like that. A lot of people, however, like early lockup on knives because they say, well, it gives it more wear or more lifetime. Because as this liner or integral, whatever you want to call it, moves across the face of the blade, at some point it will move the entire way across, and then blade play can develop.